who's the guy with all the dirt on Hollywood's biggest scandals?
I'm A.J. Benza, and I'll flip you. Heads I win, tails you lose.
What does he know?
Let me tell you something. You haven't lived until you've been thrown out of an orgy for being too funny.
Sometimes you gotta go to an author, TV host, and bigger-than-life personality to learn. Fame is a bitch.
Only in America can a man go from admitting to murdering 19 people and then go on to have his own primetime television series. And only in America can that same man live under an assumed name within the Witness Protection Program and come to operate a family-run ecstasy ring that brought in more than $500,000 a week. By the same token, only in America can the daughter and grandchildren of a mafia boss who ordered the murders of more than 100 people collect millions of dollars in TV money, appearance fees, and book deals. Yep, only in America can the families of turncoat Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano and former Gambino crime boss John Gotti have better agents and a longer IMDb page than I do. Because only in America crime pays and fame is a bitch.
I spend a lot of time in the backyard, and in '09 it was me, your fire pit, that accidentally started a wildfire when one of my embers landed on dry brush.
Spark a change, not a wildfire. Visit SmokeyBear.com, brought to you by the U.S. Forest Service, your state forester, and the Ad Council.
Let me refresh your memory a little bit. I'm talking about the release of Sammy the Bull Gravano, the former Gambino crime family underboss turned informant, who just got sprung after a 17-year stretch for operating an ecstasy ring from his Arizona home, the likes of which the feds never imagined. Gravano basically financed the drug ring that kept all of Phoenix's rave parties pumping for a long time. We're talking 30,000 pills a week at $30 a pop. That's a lot of dancing. And he wasn't looking to dabble in it either. His operation controlled the market in the entire state of Arizona. And, oh, by the way, the ring was connected to a white supremacist gang known as the Devil Dogs. Not because they like sweets. They got that name because they like to bark as they beat the shit out of their victims or killed them. Anyhow, I mentioned crime pays at the top, and that's because it always has and continues to do so. The ecstasy ring was just the latest crime Gravano committed. Way back in 1992, his testimony allowed the feds to convict John Gotti, who had been acquitted in 3 earlier trials. Because he ratted, Gravano cut a deal to only serve 5 years for racketeering. Meanwhile, he copped to whacking 19 guys, and the government handed him 5 years. Do the math. That's about 4 months per murder. But even after all that, and we're not even taking into account how many people may have died as a result of the drug ring, even after all that, I'm hearing from my sources that Sammy may get his very own TV show. Yep. And why not? His daughter, Karen Gravano, who had a little part in Daddy's drug ring, is already on the reality hit show Mob Wives on VH1, which is about to tape its 6th season. Oh, yeah, there's a lot going on with the Gravano family in 2018. This is going to be their year. Let's see. I hear Karen will be producing the show, and I know she wants it to be a serious show, not all schlocky and overproduced like a lot of reality shows tend to be. Karen's told people that her father doesn't want to do anything that would embarrass him. You know what I mean? 19 murders is one thing, but a bad reality show could really follow a guy around. It looks like the creator of Mob Wives, Jennifer Graziano, will most likely be the showrunner on this untitled Sammy the Bull project. And Jen knows how to handle talent like Sammy. After all, Jen's father, Anthony Graziano, was the consigliere for the Bonanno crime family. So not only will Karen and Sammy most likely be on the air together this coming year, but before 2017 is up, Sammy's going to be portrayed in the upcoming film, The Life and Death of John Gotti. That's the movie where John Travolta is playing the mob boss, and a longtime buddy of mine, Willie DeMeo, is portraying Gravano. And how much you want to bet Sammy will be secretly feted when the film comes out in December? That's right. We now live in a day and age where a guy who ratted out a mob boss can ride his horse back into town and be celebrated. Meanwhile, a guy like me, with over 20 years of TV under his belt, could really use the heat coming off Sammy so I can land this hosting gig for a show on the Travel Channel called Mysteries of the Mafia. The network hasn't made any decision yet, and I shouldn't talk about it too publicly. With Sammy out of the slammer now, he's probably got a better shot at it than I do. But I don't want to come across as bitter. I really don't. All this stuff about crime paying, It's nothing new. And I've always believed if you're going to be a crook, be a full crook, not a halfway crook. And I've always been sort of a halfway crook. Sammy and John, they were full on from the word go. They embrace where they were born, where they lived. They embraced the guys they grew up around, who they ran with. Me, yeah, I was born into a family with a little mob history, but I didn't go that way. My mother's uncle was a gangster named Happy Mayone. He was a killer from Meyer Lansky's Murder Incorporated. So yeah, I heard all the stories growing up, and I saw the pictures and shit, but I knew I was never going to fully embrace that lifestyle. If I had, who knows, I might be a bigger TV star right now. But all this talk and all this new news about Sammy and John got me thinking about a more nostalgic time, at a time when Gotti was a boss and Sammy was just a soldier, and I was a young reporter for Newsday, a time when the three of us all mixed together, and none of us ever dreamed we'd ever be TV stars one day. So way back in 1995, I just got done with college. I didn't know what to do yet. I was studying acting in New York City to see where that took me. And I was also working for a sports handicapping service. They were just starting to be a huge thing back then. What I did basically was call gamblers and try to get them to let me handicap their games for them every night. And I advised them what games to bet on with their bookies and how much to bet. And it was all legal. They were betting with their bookies, not me. And based on my performance, they'd pay me 10% of what they pocketed each month. And it was a business largely based on trust, but surprisingly, most degenerate gamblers are men of their word when it comes to matters of sports gambling. Anything else, they're rotten. But for gambling, they like it. One of my biggest clients was a guy who bet a ton of money on games. He was out of Colorado. He was really rich. His name was Paul Hicks, a super rich stockbroker. So his bookie dies. That means you can't bet. And I couldn't lose the guy. So I called my cousin Albert on my mother's side. Now, in 1985, my father just died. Basically, I was paying the mortgage on their house. I needed money. I was broke. So I called my cousin and I asked if I could get a big player into the gambling operation he worked at. This was out of Queens, New York. When I told him how much the guy was gambling, like 20 or 30,000 a game, he got excited. But then I told him he was from Colorado and he got sour. But he said, look, for that kind of money, I got to ask my boss if he'd make an exception. My cousin asked me, are you vouching for this guy? Because my boss is going to ask you if you're vouching for the guy. And if you say, yeah, that means you're responsible for his debt. I said, yeah, sure, I'm responsible. At this point in the story, it's important you know that my cousin's boss was John Gotti, a name that meant nothing to me and not much to a lot of people back then. Anyhow, long story short, I got Paul from Colorado to send me 20 grand up front in good faith money. And then I started to call in his games into the Queens bookmaking operation a few nights later. Eventually, Paul won some. He lost some. We always held our breath when he had a lot of money rolling. But then one weekend, he took a bath. He's down $35,000. And the day to pay up is Monday. He told me he'd send the money, but he never did. And now 3 days goes by, and it's Thanksgiving Day. And my cousin calls and puts his boss on the phone. And I hear, let me tell you something. You're going to make this right. You understand? He says, in a business without ethics, we got to have ethics. I'm going to send you and your fucking cousin 2 fuck-ups to Colorado, and I don't mean to learn how to ski. I didn't get to become John Gotti because of pricks like Paul from Colorado. Now enjoy your fucking turkey. Down goes the phone. Down goes my head into my hands. And I remember thinking, why is he saying he didn't get to become John Gotti? Who the hell is John? But the next 3 weeks of calling and writing letters to Paul Hicks in Colorado, something very scary and miraculous happened. On the night of December 13th, 1985, I'm watching TV, and the news breaks in to say that mob boss Paul Castellano had been rubbed out on a New York City sidewalk, and the reports were that a young soldier named John Gotti was already having his ring kissed on Mulberry Street in Little Italy. So now that John was the boss of the #1 crime family in America, he had much bigger fish to fry. Eventually, John told me that Paul's gambling debt was taken off the books, and that meant I was off the hook. He also told me I didn't belong in his world. Because I was a college boy, I should do better for myself. He said, do better for yourself. Do better for your mother. But my friendship with John Gotti and a few uncomfortable run-ins with Sammy the Bull was just beginning. I'm AJ Benza, and you're listening to the podcast that makes one thing absolutely clear. Fame is a bitch. A few years later, I land a newspaper job at Newsday, Long Island's newspaper, covering high school and college sports. Now, by now, John Gotti has had several years at the helm of the Gambino crime family, and Sammy has worked his way up to the powerful position of underboss. And I've gotten to meet those guys over the years in restaurants they frequented in New York City. By the way, I was never able to locate Paul Hicks ever again. I sent mail to his house abandoned, occupant gone. Real scary shit. When I showed John the letter one night, he held it up and showed the table and said, "Ain't this odd?" And that gave me chills, but I didn't want to ask anything deeper of it. Now, I know John liked that I was a college boy and was going to make something of myself. And that's why when he was finally indicted on a RICO charge, among other things, I made trips to downtown criminal court religiously to watch the proceedings and pay my respects. I wasn't the only person there who was somebody. Mickey Rourke would show up. Tupac Shakur came one time, Armand DeSante, Anthony Quinn. And it's always interesting when you're looking at people in the courtroom. Why are they there? Do they owe him a favor? Does he owe them a favor? It's very strange, that whole world of a courtroom in New York City when a mob guy's on trial. Anyhow, there was a recess in the trial, and Gotti and his crew, which included his brother Peter, Sammy the Bull, and their attorneys, they break for lunch. And when they stand up in the hallway, they go to squeeze into an elevator. Something inside me said to follow them and just walk into the goddamn elevator with them. Now, I had two friends with me, both Newsday reporters, but when the elevator opened, they didn't move. They looked at me like, "You're crazy." I said, "Fuck it," and I hopped in. They didn't. I can honestly say that moment, that dumb little moment of squeezing myself into an elevator with a bunch of killers, it kind of changed my life. It was from that point on, and I mean this 100%, from that point on, I kind of adopted that move as like my philosophy in life, which is to always move with conviction. Just go. And it seems like no big deal now as I'm talking, but if you saw that elevator and those guys inside it and the looks on their faces as their boss's fate hung in the balance, you'd understand. I'm telling you right now, nothing I've walked toward in life has ever been as scary as the men in that elevator. And real quick, I'll tell you a story why I wasn't scared. When I was about 9 years old, my father took me to the Bronx Zoo and went to the lion cage. And the lion cage was a real rickety piece of shit in the 70s. Anyhow, we're standing in front of the cage, and this lion is enormous. My father says, "Stay there, don't move," and he holds my hand. I'm nervous. I want to leave, but he says, "Stop, just stay there." Suddenly, the lion comes roaring at us, and I swear it was as loud as a fucking freight train, and I could feel the lion's breath hit me in the face. And after he was through, my father says, "You see, you're fine. Don't ever be scared of any man, because no man will ever be as ferocious or as loud as that lion." Nowadays, my father would be arrested, and I'd be with Child Protective Services, but it did help me in life. So I'm standing there in the elevator, and I could smell John's cologne. It's very intimate. And as the elevator's going down, I see Sammy Gravano eyeing me up and down. And I didn't take offense. That's his job. He protects the boss. But he grabs my leather jacket at one point, and he says, "What are you doing?" And I go, "What am I doing?" And he looks at John, who still hasn't really recognized me, and Sammy says, "What's with this fucking guy?" What John said next solidified my presence anywhere I wanted to go. He said, "Relax, Sam, he's all right." Sam says, "I seen him with the press and them." John says, "He is with the press, but he's all right. He's more all right than them." And then Sammy releases my jacket sleeve and he says, "You sure?" And then John, this is the best thing you can ever hear around a guy like that. John says, "Sam, he's with us." I did take liberties once I heard John Gotti say, "He's with us." Because he's with us means I'm protected. He's with us basically means you can't fuck with me unless you want to talk to John first. So I carried that around for a little while, this invisible shield of protection. I'm sure a lot of people hated me for it. But then a funny thing happened as I left Newsday for the Daily News. Suddenly, a lot of big shots knew who I was, and word gets around the city real quick. And it wasn't long after that I could walk into a lot of restaurants, not have a problem with the door, maybe mispaint a tab or two, maybe date the hostess. John Gotti was as big as any building in New York City, and Sammy the Bull was as dangerous and threatening as that lion at the Bronx Zoo. And as my position as a newspaper columnist brought me more power and influence, it wasn't long before I was asked or leaned on to do certain favors for some of these big, powerful men. And what are you going to do? Say no? Let me tell you how it works when you're an Italian kid with an important job in New York. At least that's how it worked in the 80s or 90s. If you're the type of Italian kid who comes from a family that had any mob ties at all, the guys find you. And depending on what kind of ties to organized crime you have or had, the things that are asked or expected of you can be very complicated. These things are impossible to flat out turn down. But know one thing. They're all things that will help them make money. That's the most important thing. If you can make them money, they'll find you. And since we've all been brought up on The Godfather, Casino, Donnie Brasco, Goodfellas, we've all been romanced by the mafia since we were little boys. And it's very hard, if not impossible, to walk away from what you're sometimes asked of. I'll give you an example of their sort of quid pro quo. In the week leading up to the 1995 Academy Awards, my column was usually chock full of stories about actors and actresses and basically all Hollywood shit. I always flew to L.A. to cover the Oscars, so the week before was an all Hollywood column. And my Sunday column, the one that ran the day of the Oscars, was truly reserved for big stars and shit like that. I get a call one day to meet a very powerful man downtown named Alley Boy. Let's just leave his name at that. Alley Boy, it turned out, had a dear friend who was in prison. Not just any guy. This guy was the acting boss of the Genovese crime family, Barney Bellomo. And before I go any further, in case you're wondering how I went from the Gambinos having me around to the Genoveses, well, like I said, it's all about making money for those guys. And there are some businesses they partner up in. One of those businesses was the giant strip club Scores. Both families had a piece, and both were making a fortune. I mentioned Scores in my column at least twice a week, and all those mentions makes the club popular, and that makes their envelopes thicker. Capiche? So Barney was away, but still running things. Now, Alley Boy tells you that Barney passed consecutive lie detector tests showing that he didn't belong on the slammer and should be released early. But nobody ever mentioned the test, let alone that he passed it. Not once, but twice. Basically, Alley Boy wanted me to put that in my column, that a crime boss beat a lie detector test. He wanted that to be in a gossip column on the Sunday that the Oscars air. So I tried to delicately tell him this is kind of out of place and my editors might not go for it. He just looked me in the eye, patted my hand and said, "You could take care of it, pal. I know you will. And Barney will be real appreciative." Now, the reason why I had to do this is because a few months earlier, they took care of something for me. I was dating a beautiful girl who was a bartender in a great nightclub they owned called Rouge. Every gangster went to Rouge. Every girl they hired was gorgeous, and most had mob guys as boyfriends. But Rebecca dumped her boyfriend when I came calling, and that tough guy didn't like that he couldn't win her back. So one night, I just left Rebecca's apartment around 3 o'clock in the morning. And with me gone and her alone, he climbed her fire escape and walked into her dark room, sat on her chest, and made her promise to leave me or else. And when she told me this, of course, I was livid. But I also knew I couldn't do shit to a guy like that. So I went to an important friend of mine with my problem. And they took care of it. Let's just say they paid a guy a visit, and he doesn't snap his fingers too much anymore. It wasn't something I was asking for, but that's what they went ahead and did. And they wouldn't accept anything from me as a token of my appreciation. Nothing. So when they need a favor from me, what am I supposed to do? You starting to understand how things work now? So you can bet your ass I found a way to put Barney Bellomo in my gossip column. And the story actually helped spring Barney from prison early. But then I moved to L.A., and it was kind of off my mind. But sometimes I talk to my friend from New York, and he tells me, Barney wants to show you his appreciation. I say, that's okay, man. Just tell him we're all even. I'm AJ Benza, and this is Fame is a Bitch. If I'm starting to sound a little nostalgic for the old days, you got to excuse me. I happen to think New York City was better when the gangsters wore suits and the bad guys stuck to things they were great at. I also long for the days when not every gangster became another stool pigeon with a screenplay. What I never expected from a bunch of men who prized anonymity was seeing the day when the most important mob informant in history was going to have to join M.a.f.i.a and get his own TV show. And that means the next logical step might be bumping into Sammy Gravano at an audition now and then. Or maybe seeing him slide up to an agent at the Ivy. Or worse yet, my agent. And then what am I supposed to do? Grab him by his jacket and let him know I'm glad he's one of us? Or better yet, tell him the canyons are quicker than the freeways? Or that Dan Tanner's is best on a Thursday? That smoothies are overrated? And that fame is a bitch.